The People's Platform.
Good evening and welcome to the show. My guest tonight is CEO of the Advocata Institute, Dhananath Fernando. Good evening and welcome, Dhananath.
Good evening, Sonali.
Dhananath, recently cabinet approval was granted to increase the value-added tax or VAT from 15% to 18%. When taxes become oppressive, people have to rely on loans and charity. And on the other hand, when taxation is disproportionate, that is also problematic. So according to this, a billionaire will pay 18% on a kilogram of dal. The sex worker earning 3,000 rupees through her unregulated trade will also be paying 18% for a kilo of dal. Take us through how problematic the disproportionality is.
Basically, Sonali, direct taxes, there are two types of taxes called direct taxes and indirect taxes. So VAT, the value added taxes, basically falling into the indirect taxes category, which everybody has to pay. The real reasons are basically in any taxation system there are four principles that we have to adhere. One is the tax system has to be simple, it has to be transparent, it has to be neutral, and it has to be stable. Now we are basically violating tax principles in multiple points in this case, because earlier, if you recall, the VAT was at VAT was at I think 15%, and we brought it down to I think about 8%, and again we increased to 15%, and now from 15% we are increasing it to 18%. So basically the concept or the principle of stability we are violating, because we are going to change it over a period of time. At the same time, I think the reason why they had to increase VAT is also because of there was a conversation about increasing the salaries of the government workers. Of course, I have no objection for salary increment of anyone, but of course with 1.5 million government sector workers, it has also becoming challenging because the size of the government is too big. If you increase the salaries, it has someone has to bear that cost. So unfortunately, that who has to bear that cost is, as you very correctly mentioned, everybody. And when you say everybody, it is falling more towards the shoulders of the very, very poor people. Most likely they may also consider sometimes giving I don't know, with the budget coming up in next few weeks, they may be also considering to revise some of the pay taxes. I mean, maybe to bring it down, because they can capture some of the tax foregone through pay reduction, maybe through that. We don't know. That may be one incident, one scenario. But I know with that increase, of course, the prices of all goods and services under VAT will go up, and to an extent the consumption will also go down, because the same sex worker you mentioned who was earning 3,000 rupees, he or she may not be able to afford the same 1 kilogram of rice that they consumed. So the consumption will also come down. That's what's going to happen, and it is basically what you say is to keep a ratio between 80% direct taxes to 20% indirect taxes. In Sri Lanka's context, some time ago it was 22% direct taxes and 78% indirect taxes, if I recollect right.
Yikes. Okay. So Dhananath, we are having this conversation in the backdrop of being in an IMF program whilst managing debt restructuring and looking at macroeconomic stability. And we have an upcoming budget in the next few weeks. Let's talk a bit about ways in which we can look at revenue generation. The moment you think revenue generation, it doesn't mean you have to increase people's taxes, right? There are other ways. I'd like to draw your attention also to the fact that we need to perhaps hold to account policymakers. What can we do in terms of monetary policy, fiscal policy, managing the economy, where they too feel the burden a little, because it's just the people who are having to deal with all of this nonsense.
Absolutely. So the policymakers they have been acting very irresponsibly on one side. One thing that they can do is there are also tax concessions being provided, because tax concessions is the other side of basically targeting certain people and taxing. because when you give a tax concession for one particular category, of course again someone has to pay for it. Like when the government salaries are increased, someone like the poor people have to bear that burden. Same way, then you give a tax concession, the same burden has to be borne by again the poor people or someone else. So there are multiple tax concessions given, and even in the IMF diagnostic governance diagnostic report it has been mentioned that there is the strategic act where the minister has the sole authority to give tax exemptions mentioning that it is a strategic project. At the same time, the finance minister has the powers to impose certain super gain taxes overnight, as you may have, I mean I'm sure everyone has heard, like overnight there's a super gain tax or super levy, super commodity levy SCL on dal, on sugar, and it's imposed overnight, and also it can be taken off overnight. So all these are also tend to corruption, because when you impose a tax overnight and also when you give a tax concession to a person, of course they can have a lot of negotiations, and of course these taxes are not going to impact politicians. In fact, they are going to benefit from these tax concessions and the powers that they have. That's why we recommend, and as you very correctly said, just increasing the tax rate doesn't mean that you are necessarily increasing the tax revenue, because when you increase it above one point, people are trying to find out loopholes and they are basically evading the taxes. So just because you need to increase the tax revenue, it doesn't mean that you have to unlimitedly increase the tax rate. You have to increase the tax base and also stick to this principle: simple, transparency, stability, and neutrality, because that way you can increase the tax base and you can increase the tax revenue.
Let's speak a bit about the responsibility and role of the Inland Revenue Department in this paradigm. Is the job being properly done, or are some people going scot-free?
IMF, I will quote the IMF diagnostic report. They have said one of the most corrupt institutes are the three revenue generating institutes of the government, basically the Sri Lanka Customs, which collecting taxes from the border, Inland Revenue Department, which collects the taxes from corporates, from pay, the other taxes, and the Excise Department, which collects the taxes from liquor companies and tobacco companies. So what happens is, in any parts of the world, basically these three institutes tend to have some level of corruption, but the more that we have deviated tax rates and complications, of course it's very likely that they will also prone to or incentivizing for corruption. That's one side. Or I think on the Inland Revenue Department side, there are, I think, genuine concerns also on the tax administration side. I think in terms of the know-how and in terms of the staff, I think there are restrictions, and also mainly on the systems, because they are running a system, I think it hasn't been upgraded, and I think there's a bill that is due for about, I think, 12 billion to upgrade that RAMIS system. So basically you really do not have the proper infrastructure or the basic fundamentals to collect the taxes. So that's all three incurring at the same time. Basically the only way that the government can consider is also increasing the VAT, because VAT administration is fairly easier than collecting the personal income taxes.
Yeah, but they can't go to the lowest hanging fruit.
Absolutely, that is unfair. I mean, that's why I think the government also, with the IMF targets of, they have mentioned that we are 15% behind from the targets that we promised to the IMF in terms of revenue collection. So I think when you are stick to, you also need the IMF second tranche that you need to get, and then you also want to increase the government salaries. So ultimately, the burden was shared with the poor common people.
Dhananath, at a macro level, with all the loans that we've taken internationally and the debt we've racked up, will we be trapped in an endless cycle of debt? I mean, this is one of the sort of conceptual fears that people have, and over dinner conversations you wonder. So from an economist's point of view, could you educate us?
There is a higher chance that this will become a vicious cycle if we don't do the reforms, because the context is, Sonali, our debt to GDP ratio is the way that you measure the size of the debt. It is like, imagine you have a cake which is weighing for about 1 kilogram, and you are putting a weight on top of it which is 128 percentage of the size of the cake. So if the cake is 1 kilogram, we are putting 1280 kilograms on top of the cake is the pressure that the cake will get. So obviously the cake is going to get squashed, and after 10 years, that's in 2032, what we expect to reduce this size of the weight which was kept on top of the cake is about 95%. So it's still quite heavy for the cake, because you are bringing it from 128% to 95% in 10 years time, and that is if we do everything right, and provided that we would also be lucky with kind weather, without any natural disasters. So in that context, if we don't go in the right direction, again we have to default the defaulted debt.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's look at economic reform or economic recovery, like we look at a company that is loss making, and then suddenly you see companies turn around with good management, with a proper strategy, with proper multi-sectoral consultation, etc. What can we do as citizens, as other stakeholders, to expedite this process and be active stakeholders in the country's economic recovery? Because it's easy for us to also criticize the government and say that they're not doing enough. But if we are also active participants, if we also understand the principles of economics, at least from a layman's point of view, don't you think that more can be done? What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. The citizens' economic literacy and basic know-how and understanding is very important, and what they can do is to stand for those reforms. Because for an instance, when the electricity bill when the government is deciding to increase it, they have to demand for where's the analysis for this increase, and whether it is right what has been provided by the CEB. That pressure has to be mounted to the government and the government institutes, because otherwise always when there's something, they are just going to pass it very easily to the common people. You know, in a company you can't do it, just because when the cost factors are increasing, you can't just, without increasing the efficiency, you can't just pass the cost to the consumer, because consumers have choice. The other company may be productive, and if they sell it the same product at a lower price, the other company is going to face a big trouble. So likewise, as people, we have to constantly demand for those analysis, and we have to stand for reforms, and especially for governance reforms on the other side, because there is a massive governance problem. While we stand for economic reforms, there are structural issues at a governance level that we have to sort out. Without sorting that out, or without taking both sides together, it is a mammoth task for us to overcome this situation. So definitely, as people, we have to constantly stand for reforms and basically ask for the analysis in terms of the governance front, to make sure that the reforms are completed fully.
In general, Dhananath, politicians aren't really bothered to fix the system or develop the country, because it's too much. So they prefer to enrich themselves, their families, give all the tenders to their relatives and extended family, as a result of which they perpetuate this system of bribery and corruption and distance themselves from the people. So they don't see themselves as those holding public trust on behalf of the people. In this backdrop, what needs to be done from an economist's point of view again?
For politicians to get corrupted, Sonali, there are two sides. One is there's this structural issues. Now, what I mentioned as a strategic development act is a structural issue. When you avoid that, you have basically given the room in the law to incentivizing them for bribery and corruption, because when you have that strategic act, you can invite your friend to come as an investor and you can give a tax concession, and then basically you are going to get benefit out of it. So basically that has to be ironed out, because no point also blaming the politicians when you have the loopholes of the system, and of course they have created it for their own benefit. So that has to be clear. Even if you look at the customs, the tariff, the deviation, like you have tariffs from 107% to 30%. So when you have such a deviated tariff system, of course the person who is importing something under 107% tariff is going to speak to that custom officer and asking about whether they can change it for a 30% tariff structure. So of course the person who has the authoritative power is incentivized to get something from bringing it from 107% to 30% tariff. So ideally, but if you have a flat tariff rate, then no one really want to test it out, because then you are better off by paying the taxes at a lower rate and getting it, rather than trying to override the system. So those structural things has to change. So few structural things are basically on the trade side. We have to minimize that tariff deviation. That will actually increase the government revenue. That will solve a lot of issues. You need not to increase the VAT, because if you can get the revenue at the borders when people importing, because as I said, when you have 103% tariff, basically that is going as corruption, because they are going to pass that 103% under the 30% tariff, and the balance will get divided among few individuals. But if you have actually a 30% tariff, everything which is getting under 103%, which now we are not getting any revenue, will come under a different tariff line, and you can increase. And this research has been done, and it has been proved that the tariff rates are, when you have a simple tariff structure, the revenue numbers are going to increase. And also the state-owned enterprises reforms. Now one example is what we expected to earn from pay taxes, where the middle class have a massive impact. I am sure, Sonali, you may also have an impact on the pay taxes. The expected revenue to collect from all the pay taxes for a year is 100 billion. Easy to remember, 100 billion. One state-owned enterprise in 2022 lost 622 billion in 8 months. That means if everyone pays pay taxes for 6 years, which would be adequate to cover 8 months losses of one state-owned enterprise. So basically, rather than you are pushing the pay taxes, it's easier you get rid of these loss-making state-owned enterprises, because that way you can save a lot of revenue, because now what you are collecting is you are filling it to a bottomless pot. You cannot fill it. I mean, how can you fill a 600 billion versus 100 billion? I mean, to what extent can we increase the taxes?
So Dhananath, this is common sense.
Absolutely, this is common sense. And as I always say, economics is not, you need not to hold a PhD to understand this. It's common sense, but I think the willpower is a question mark. And as famously said, politicians also know what needs to be done, but the problem is, I think they are not sure whether they can come back to power after doing what is needed to be done, because as you very correctly said, their relatives, their supporters have been offered this high profile chairmanships at these state-owned enterprises, so they are funding, they are getting benefited. So there is a vicious cycle, and that's what we have to break. And the only way, of course, you can appoint honest people, but even the honest people are becoming dishonest given this structure. So the best way is you allow it to a market system to work, because it has an automatic correction, like your news channel. I mean, you can't do anything because you have a competition outside. You have to be productive, you have to be truthful, you have to be on point on everything that you do, because otherwise you will lose your viewership. So likewise, when the government runs monopolies, they are given a big incentive to be corrupt. That's why they appoint their relatives. But if you allow the more players to enter, and if you allow the private players to come and invest, so then they can't do the same thing. Even if there's corruption, that has to be borne by the shareholders. But in this case, when the government runs the businesses, all the losses, all the corruption is automatically getting passed to the consumer, who has nothing to do with that institute. I mean, Sri Lankan Airlines has about $1.2 billion debt. And I am sure a lot of poor people in Sri Lanka, those who are the 7 million people who are below the poverty line, I think even they haven't been in an aeroplane ever in any airline. So there has nothing to do with that. So, but of course, with the VAT increase, they have to pay. and they are basically covering the losses of so many other things. So that's unfair, and that's why we always recommend you have to cut down expenditure. You only can't try to increase revenue and bridge this gap, and it doesn't make sense. And also the other option that the government has is you can print more money. Printing more money is also a tax, because that means you are basically devaluing the money and the prices will go up.
We saw how that
we saw that episode. I'm sure everyone learned a lesson, hopefully, from that modern monetary theory. But you can't do that. And then again, the same person, the sex worker who was earning 3,000 rupees, the value of the real value of that basket will come to about 1,500 rupees. That's what actually happened. That's how the 100 rupee 1 kilogram of rice went to 200 rupees. And when the inflation even coming down, the prices are not coming down. Inflation is the rate that the prices are increasing. It's not the prices are coming down. So the same sex worker who earlier paid 100 rupees, now still after inflation being at 2%, has to pay the same 200 rupees, which is twice as higher as he or she paid earlier.
Dhananath, I feel like one of the key issues that prevents us from seeing solutions is that policymakers don't feel the pain of the people. They don't feel the hunger pangs, they don't feel the angst and the suffering of the people who they don't really care about. So the gap is so wide that no matter what we may say, no matter what the activists or the courts may say, it just falls on deaf ears. So I think that there's a problem in that whole structure. Given that structure, let's look at the budget. What needs to be prioritized?
Still, I would say the reforms has to prioritize. Generally, as Lee Kuan Yew once said, Sri Lankan budgets are an auction of non-existing resources. So every time the finance minister comes and says, yeah, I'm going to give this, give that, and all those things, and nothing happens. And this has been tracked by institutes like Verity Research. I think the progress, the completion rate of those budget proposals are about 20% or 22%.
Right.
And I recall, I live in Moratuwa. Since I was a schoolboy, every budget they say we are going to extend the marine drive to Moratuwa. We are going to extend the marine drive to Moratuwa. Since I was a schoolboy, and without any shame, they repeat it in every budget at the same time. So likewise, there are multiple budget proposals that we can easily point out that it was just announcements, nothing has happened.
Okay.
So in this budget, again, I would say, rather than just promising things which cannot be delivered, it is better to focus on the fundamentals of the economy and make it right, because that at least will give a indication for investors. But the tax policy and things like that, which we have been changing quite often, quite recently, and in short period, won't work, because the worst thing that you could do to a market is providing uncertainty, because market can absorb bad news, because when you have a bad news, you adjust. Sure. When you have a good news, you adjust. But when you keep in uncertainty, you don't know what to do. So bad news is not the problem, but you giving a bad news to market, but don't give uncertainty. But we are changing the taxes, changing expenditure, everything, everywhere is providing not bad news. It's basically the bad news is you're providing uncertainty. That's the worst thing that can be done. So I hope the budget won't provide any uncertainty, but if they can still provide the consistency on the fundamentals, I think that's the best thing that the budget could do. But other promises, these giveaways and all that, I don't take it very seriously, because we all know the government doesn't have money to give anything. I mean, the interest cost is the highest cost in the budget. So when you have that level of interest to be paid, you really do not have any other money left to do anything else. And hopefully they won't again print money to bridge that gap. Then we are making things worse.
My final question, looking at the way forward for Sri Lanka's economy, you said that we need to pay close attention to reform. Speak to us about a few reform initiatives that mandatorily need to take place within the next 12-year period.
State-owned enterprises has to reform. I think there's some progress made, but it's not adequate. Some state-owned enterprises are in the process of reforms, but again the transparency has to be issued. As it was famously said, a lot of businessmen either made money by selling something very valuable at dirt cheap rate to the government, or buying something very valuable thing from the government at a dirt cheap rate. So this privatization cannot have any corruption cases, because they can also make money out of even the privatization or the state-owned enterprises reforms process. But it has to happen. You cannot run like a 600 billion loss making company and asking people to pay taxes and VAT to cover that. Second, the trade reforms has to happen, because Sri Lanka is a small country. We have to produce and sell to the world if we really want to earn money. There is no other way. You as a professional, as a professional, we have to provide a service to earn a living. There is no other way that we can earn money. You have to work hard and provide a service. Providing a service is solving someone else's problem. You are, as a lawyer, as a journalist, you are solving someone else's problem, and that they are happy, and then from that you are making an earning. Same for me as economic researcher. I am solving someone's problem, and if I am not solving someone's problem, no one is willing to pay me, neither you. So as a country also, we have to solve someone's problem as providing goods and services, and also trade internationally. So to do that, we have to do a lot of trade reforms. The tariff structure is one key bottleneck, so you have to reform that. Second, and third, we have to also change on the regulatory front, because a lot of young businesses, in terms of registering a business, for women to work overtime on flexible work hours, that has become a challenge, and our women labour force participation is very low. So as a result, women are very reluctant to join the labour force, and they are quite capable. And look at the event that the young lady who won a gold medal in the Asian Games without even giving the access to the grounds. So they are capable, and they can, and that, imagine the tourism and the brand recognition which Sri Lanka got in terms of tourism just because of that one victory. So they should be incorporated into the labour force, and why don't we provide them the freedom? So those three has to happen. And also I think there's for export boosting, we do not have any export zones anymore. 95% of the western province lands have been already occupied. So those reforms need to come faster.
All right, fantastic. That was very comprehensive, and what a great 28 minutes. Thank you so much, Dhananath Fernando. Thank you for watching us. We'll see you again tomorrow. Good night.